Healing strengthens the identity. So here's the difference between coping and healing. Coping, losing yourself in the relationship. Right? So again, here in a healthy relationship, we're strengthening our individual identity and our collective identity. But let's pause on the individual identity. The coping part is you lose yourself in that person. And there's something that's unhealthy, that you're so in love that you sacrifice everything of even your own identity, your values, your goals, and you find yourself lost in the other person. That's not healthy. I have a question. What does being healed enough really look like in a relationship? What does it really mean to be healed enough to have a healthy relationship? Welcome to the world of why healing in new relationships is the new standard. That's right, a space where we'll challenge the idea that love in a relationship alone is not enough. Because the truth is, most people don't enter relationships healed. They enter the relationships hoping that the relationship will heal them, right? That's the brokenness that manages to find its way into relationship. And when this happens, which is why I'm going to slow down and we're going to take some time to this discussion, that we don't question our wounds, we begin to question the relationship. So this is going to set the tone. And when we really pause for a second and begin to think about why I'm arguing that it's the new standard in relationships, that piece, that having this as an outright expectation that healing is something that someone should be able to expect as they enter into a relationship. So here we're shifting the narrative. And here in this discussion, it's really about understanding that love without healing becomes matters of survival. So that means if we're not careful, we'll enter relationships, and that where we enter, that when and where we enter in that relationship becomes part of our surviving mechanism or our coping mechanism. Commitment without growth in a relationship also becomes nothing more than pressure. So we're looking at survival and we're looking at pressure. This is why, again, I'm arguing that healing is the new standard in relationships. And connection without self-awareness becomes conflict. So let that sit in for a moment. Survival, pressure, and conflict over healing, growth, and self-awareness. So I'm setting the tone for what I'm arguing today, that when we began to explore why healing, both individually and collectively, is no longer optional for relationships. Y'all, I'm going to be honest here. I have a strong position and passion here that I want to have healthy relationships. I want to see children being raised in healthy two-parent homes or healthy co-parenting homes. I'm really taking these strong stances here, and the healing process becomes the new standard. It's the standard for healthy, sustainable relationships, whether you have children, whether you're co-parents, or whether you're living together. I'm arguing that it's the new standard. I'm taking this position because when you think about where the state of relationships and where the state of marriage is today, we'll see why having healing as a new standard is something that I'm taking a strong position on. So here's a couple stats I just want to throw at your way. As of 2023, about 1/3 of Americans who have ever been married have had a divorce. And roughly 2.4% of marriages occur for every one divorce. So the trend that they're saying here is while marriages were once common at a younger age, Americans are now marrying later. A lower percentage of young adults are married compared to the previous generations. So we're looking at some patterns and some trends. Even we're seeing, as the CDC and others have pointed out here, by the age of 55, about 87% of adults have married at least one time, and 40% have divorced at least once. So that means that the average first marriage ends in divorce lasts about 8 years. And so something is happening. Something is occurring that we began to look at this here. Let's continue to look at some more stats as we kind of, as I make the argument of why healing becomes the new standard. Even from an ethnicity, here's what CDC has shown. Among those who have ever been married, African Americans are the most likely to divorce, 41%, while Asian Americans are the least likely, 16%. Geographically speaking, and this might come as a little surprise, the southern states generally saw lower marriage to divorce ratios, while northern states and Midwest states are often have higher rates. And that's a little refreshing considering when you're thinking that most African Americans in this country live in the South. Right. So the exception here is in 2020 saw a 12% decline in divorces, according to the Pew report. And when you began to look at it, it may have something to do with the pandemic and people were, forced to live together in isolation, or it could have been that decline because trying to file for a divorce during the pandemic was complicated. Regardless, what we do know is that we began to see a decline in the divorce rates. And I like to really kind of add it or put the weight on that when we were in isolation, it was an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit more. Now, part of the other issue here is why these divorce rates or these breakup rates, and again, why I'm saying healing is a new standard, is because people are not taking advantage of counseling and people are finding themselves encountering some of the same issues across many relationships. Here's an example. Communication issues drive about 65% of the couples who are in therapy. That means they're going around communication issues. Hey, just wanted to jump in for a moment to invite you every Tuesday night at 6:30 p.m. when I go TikTok Live. That's 6:30 Eastern Time. We engage in great conversations. I have guests coming on in. And guess what? You get to engage me. I can't wait to bring you in live so we can take these conversations to the next level. That's at Dr. Gio White at the TikTok Live. I'll see you Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. Infidelity accounts for about 30% of therapy. So I know some of y'all might think that the cheating and infidelity is leading. No, it's the communication. That's why I spend so much time talking about communication. And then thirdly, financial stress impacts, right? So 22% of couples are seeking help, and the conflicts are centering around financial issues. So hopefully you see what we're getting at here, like communication, and then the infidelity, and then the financial issues. Only 15% of U.S. adults have attended couples therapy. So now we're talking about the need to go and get help or to counter it. And so what we're seeing here as we set the tone, again, I'm making a case of why healing is the new standard, but to heal, some things you can't do by yourself. That's right. Some challenges and things that we're facing is bigger than you or more complicated. You got yourself into it. The idea of you being able to resolve it becomes problematic. But the need for therapy, going in, and we'll look at the different language in a moment, but therapy and going in and seeing someone becomes important. The challenge is with communication being one of the major issues and only seeing about 15% of adults attending couples therapy, right, becomes a problem. Yet 70 to 75% of the couples who do go improve when they do attend the therapy. Let that sit in. That while only 15% of the people are going, of those that do go, we see 75% indicating that their communication, their relationship improved. And 71% reported better relationship, the relationship overall being better. So the challenge here is literally getting people into therapy and being willing to kind of take the chance to learn and understand a clinical professional third ear hearing. So even more telling, couples often wait years before they go in. We're typically around 4 years before they even seek help. So this is a problem in of itself, again, because we're saying that it's the new standard. But the challenge is sometimes for us, when we see couples or individuals, it's literally that 4 years, 5, 6 years, people are finally coming. That's sort of like, to use the analogy, being in a plane and it's out of gas and it's falling, and now you want to come to therapy. But guess what? We understand that people are more likely to come in crisis, and really good therapists, they understand that. They really get that. But another way to kind of translate this, most couples are not failing because love is absent in the relationship. They're struggling because the healing is delayed. That means trying to get people in at an earlier age and trying to get them to come in before things begin to escalate. Because there's some relationship disruptors. These are some things that kind of contribute to the coping aspect of the relationship. And again, I'm saying healing is a new standard, not coping. But some of the common disruptors in healthy relationships and how it shows up is communication breakdowns. We see that, and that speaks to why there's so many people who cite that as the biggest issue. Unresolved childhood trauma is another relationship disruptor. You brought that childhood trauma into your relationship. Y'all, I have a podcast. Y'all got to go to my podcast channel and take a look at the TSA and the analogy that I actually give. What happens when we go from one relationship to the next. And I use the TSA as an example, is that you go through the pre-check. And when they go through the pre-check, what are they doing there? They're looking for baggage and stuff that you have in there that you should not take with you on your destination. So the unresolved childhood traumas sometimes become the things that we bring into our new relationship, and it becomes a relationship disruptor, not realizing that you have these traumas and you're now imposing those traumas into that new relationship. Another disruptor in this notion of a relationship being a healer is emotional disconnection. This is a very interesting piece here where we're making the case why healing has to be a standard. But you have some people here that they say, well, I'm not really an emotional person. I wasn't raised that way. That's that childhood trauma or that form of bonding that occurred at the childhood, and you bring it and you've learned to be disconnected. Infidelity and betrayal are also disruptors, and financial stress, as we said, as disruptors, but also unmet expectations, right? The challenge that happens sometimes that we go into relationships and we go into marriage and we have all these high expectations way at the beginning of the marriage or way at the beginning of the relationship. The problem is you didn't share those expectations at the beginning of the relationship. Y'all know that some people will go all the way into a marriage. You then went from dating to engagement to marriage. Some people go all the way to having a children, not necessarily in order. And then you are sharing these expectations that you have, only to discover that your mate says, ain't no way in the world I'm going to buy into that. So we see this as one of the relationship disruptors. And of course, we can never abandon the role of mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, etc., showing up or becoming some of the barriers or what we're calling disruptors in forming healthy relationships. And so we have to lay this out, that the stress and things like that really become cyclical in some relationships, presenting it from being from a healthy standpoint. And when I say cyclical, here's what I mean. Mental health affects relationships, and then the relationship affects the mental health, and then the mental health affects the relationship. So this cyclical process begins to show up and becomes problematic in relationships. So what I'm offering you all is that I'm trying to say that we have to take a stance way at the beginning of the relationship. And if you're in one, this is the time to have the family meeting, to take a position that we're going to make healing as the new standard in relationship. So there's some reasons why I'm going to argue that healing as a standard. I'm going to give you 7 reasons why I'm saying to you that it has to be a standard in new relationship. Number 1, healing reveals patterns. Healing reveals patterns. For example, coping in relationships says, this is just how relationships are. But healing says, this is what I learned and I can change it. Y'all see the difference? So when we are saying about the healing patterns, when we are in a coping mindset, and all these little compare coping and the healing, and where we see the difference, because if I say this is just how things are, it's a point of learned helplessness. That's where the cyclical part comes in. But when the healing becomes the standard, that's why this is what I've learned, and this is what I want to change. Can you imagine having a family meeting, or you sitting down with your partner and you're telling partners, well, this is kind of how I learned to do things. I know I need to change it, but this is just kind of how we learn to deal with conflict. So it's a point of openness, and you're giving your partner an opportunity to move towards the healing. Number two, healing improves communication. I already told y'all that communication becomes one of the major relationship disruptors, right? But when we look at healing, it says therapy improves the communication about 75% of couples. So here, because it improves the communication, coping says we can figure this out ourselves. But healing says, let's go talk to somebody who's neutral and have the tools to help us deal with whatever the barrier that we are dealing with. So I love that, right? Coping is silent treatment. Healing is an emotional vocabulary, and it's an expression. So when we look at these in terms of communication, we give that extra attention to it, because coping, when it's silent treatment, you trying to deal with your stuff, she trying to deal with her stuff, and it's silent treatment. But that healing, when we really slow down and look at its role in communication, that's where the value comes in. It's the emotional vocabulary. It is the communication and expressing how I feel, or this is what I'm going through. And when we become aware of it, again, this becomes part of the healing standards. What I'm giving you are things that are designed to help heal the relationship and maintain it. So let's take a look at it. Healing reduces emotional reactivity. Now remember, there's a difference between responding and reacting. And the only difference between responding and reacting is that with responding, you think before you act. Reacting, there's no thought or process or analyzing before you act. And so here, coping, yelling, shouting, and shutting down. Where healing is understanding the triggers before reacting to them. So here, in terms of understanding, reducing emotional reactivity, that means that you're doing your own healing work and understanding your triggers. And I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again, that some of us got too many damn triggers. Right? They're like emotional landmines. You're trying to get somebody to come closer to you, but you got so many triggers or these emotional landmines. And when someone steps on them, right? This is the coping. Someone steps on them, and then that trigger brings everything forward. And I'm going to always argue that triggers are nothing more than manifestations or signs or cues of unresolved issues or unresolved traumas. And so instead of dealing with the traumas, we create triggers or roadmaps or signs or warning signs that says, dead end road up ahead. So the healing as a new standard is understanding the triggers before we react to them. Healing, it rebuilds trust. And when you're in a healthy relationship where healing is the standard, we see these healing coping mechanisms. Here it says where the coping just says, just move on. We got a conflict, something happened, let's just move on. But healing, processing betrayal, it rebuilds safety and intentionally aids us in taking positions to understand what we need to do to get over some of the conflict. But the coping part here, and what kills trust, is the idea of just removing or moving on and not allowing some time for someone who's been hurt to understand it. That a healing part is validating how someone feels. And again, it becomes important that even if you've hurt someone and it wasn't intentional, the healing standard in the relationship still is going to validate the pain that they've been through, and having compassion and understanding of what they're dealing with. Another way in healing becomes the standard is, and I like this, healing strengthens the identity. So here's the difference between coping and healing. Coping, losing yourself in the relationship. right? So again, here in a healthy relationship, we're strengthening our individual identity and our collective identity. But let's pause on the individual identity. The coping part is you lose yourself in that person. And there's something that's unhealthy, that you're so in love that you sacrifice everything of even your own identity, your values, your goals, and you find yourself lost in the other person. That's not healthy. That's a coping standard in a relationship, as opposed to the healing, maintaining individuality within the connection. And so we're seeing, as we take the position of why it's the new standard, it becomes a healthy position that we find ourselves in. Now, I told you all way at the beginning of this particular podcast, I said a lot of people come into relationships with some form of healing that's being needed. But let's pause, because as a healthy standard, healing breaks the generational trauma. Coping doesn't. Why? Because coping repeats the family dysfunction, while healing consciously choosing to do a different behavior. So this is how all the men dealt with issues in your family. Y'all know, because your grandfather did it. When he got mad, he just bounced. When your dad got mad, he just bounced. And now you get mad and then you follow the pattern. So we're seeing that in a healing as a new standard, you make a conscious decision to do something differently. This is how we began to break the cycles. Now hear me. You all, a lot of times, will hear the discussion about generational curses and breaking generational curses. In my argument that healing is the new standard for relationship, I just want to pause, because I want to make a distinction between a pattern and a curse. If it's a curse, that means that your behavior, you're writing up your behavior, and you're writing up the behavior of your parents and your parents' parents. You're writing it as some type of divine possession, something that's beyond your world or worldly view. Some spiritual thing has impact. This is what I call curses, right? So I never buy into it. What I'm buying into is patterns. And so even the language in this regard, one is of a coping and one is of a healing. The coping says this is a generational curse and we need to just get through it. But healing said these are patterns that we're going to be intentional about breaking, because healing creates what I'm calling intentional love. Coping does something totally different. So when coping is the strategy, you stand together because it's time invested. I'm standing in this relationship. I don't feel like it is toxic, it's unhealthy. So when coping is the standard of relationship, then you're doing things to just go and manage work day to day. But healing as the new standard says choosing the relationship from a place of wholeness. So I know some of these sound a little different, but I need you all in this dialogue and in this discussion, and as you share what I'm sharing with you, with others, that you get to the point of you begin to ask first and do your own inventory. Am I in a healing relationship, or am I in a coping relationship? Or you begin to ask yourself, how do I make healing the new strategy? Coping is survival, day to day. Healing is transformation. We're trying to grow. We're trying to take our relationship to another level. So letting the issues fade away in healing is talking it through. And so the coping, you all have seen how some conflicts occur. Y'all blow up, you have a big fight, y'all walk away, y'all let the anger and intensity fade and go down. And then all of a sudden, y'all come back together and pretend like it never happened. That's the coping, when coping is the standard of the relationship. But the healing is if you come back, y'all talk through the issue so that you won't put more and more issues on what I'm referring to as the emotional shelf. And so healing as a new standard with what I've outlined for you, and healing as a new standard when we look at what happens in relationships and we look at what happens in marriages when we don't do it, then we have to begin to take a position and ask ourselves, what is the standard in our relationship that we're operating from? And it is my hope that once you take this inventory, that you began to take a conscious decision, that you had your first family meeting and you sit down and say, Let's develop a new standard of healing as opposed to coping. I'm Dr. Gary O. White, and this is my truth.